native orchids. And hopefully, by the time I'm done, you'll have the same feeling that I do, that we really need to do something about them because a lot of them are in trouble. So let's get going here. I hope. Uh-oh. Why isn't my slide advancing? There we go. Okay. So as Liz mentioned, there are a lot of native orchids. I'll give you some more information on that in a few minutes. And they come in all sizes and all colors, and I've just selected a few of them to give you some idea of the sort of ranges that we have. Some have big flowers, some have really teeny flowers. But there's a vast array of different morphologies, colors, things like that. And many of them are incredibly beautiful. So a lot of them even have potential to grow in your gardens and to be used in a horticultural way. And I've just in this slide, I've collected some photos of species of Platanthera, those four that are on the left over here. And you can see there's a commonality to them. The lip comes in different shapes and sizes, but a lot of diversity there. And then the lady slippers are really incredible, and they come in, again, all kind of sizes and colors, and the flowers are just beautiful. So there's a lot of potential for using native orchids once we learn how to propagate them, which we do not know how to do in almost all cases at this stage of the game. What got me interested in orchids is after I came to the Smithsonian, they encouraged us to do long-term ecological research, and I'm a woodland plant guy. I like woodland herbs. And so I started doing some work at our facility in Annapolis, Maryland. We have about 3,000 acres of land there. So I started some studies, and as time went on, I became more and more interested in the orchids that were in our forest for reasons like you're looking at here. So these are examples of four orchids that are wintergreen. So these are plants that are doing their best now after the leaves all fall from the trees. The rattlesnake plantain is pretty common in our area. The putty root is just has a single leaf that's up in the winter. It disappears in like May, and the plant flowers, but you don't find the plant in the summer. The genus Spiranthes have some species that are spring, some that are autumn, some that are summer. This is a spring one. It's up, it lives, you can find the green leaves in the winter. And then the cranefly orchid, which is a really common orchid around here, has just a single leaf per plant, and it's up now. It's here in the winter. So that was intriguing, these different life history strategies. And of course, many of the orchids are typical of a lot of the native plants, is that they flower in the spring. And so the pink lady slipper, which you have in Western Pennsylvania, is an example of that. The small world pagoni is a species that we've been working on for quite a few years now. It's federally threatened. It was thought to be extinct in Pennsylvania, but they've actually found, I think, one, maybe two populations recently. So there's a lot of research on this orchid. And then one that's really the most common one, other than that tipularia that I just showed you, is the showy orchid. This is really common in our forest at our part of the Smithsonian. This color, the color doesn't show up on this particular slide. It's a really beautiful orchid. So you're a native plant group, but people that like orchids in orchid societies, they're really into the flowers. And much of what we know about orchids have really come from people that have studied the evolution of species, pretty much the differences in flowers. And if you look globally, of course, the diversity is enormous. And orchids are really interesting. This is this cranefly orchid over here on the right that has a leaf in the winter. And here's a close-up of its flower. And it has a typical orchid flower. I'm not going to spend time talking much about that. But this one has a spur. You can see the spur going back here. And from here back, that's where the nectar is. And so for pollination to occur, there's a moth that pollinates this orchid. It sticks its nose in here, puts the tongue down here, and gets some nectar. When it does that, it gets pollen stuck on its head and moves around. So a lot of what we know about orchids have come from people who have studied the flowers, but orchids have intrigued people for a long, long time. And if you haven't seen this book, I would refer you to it. It's a good read. Erica wrote this book a couple of years ago, and in it are stories about how people have been smitten by orchids and resulting in all kinds of things happening around the world. It's a good read, so I encourage you to try to find it and have a read. But orchids go way back. Charles Darwin, who is kind of the father of modern science in many ways, he did The Origin of Species back in 1859, and of course this was blasphemy. It was changing the way everybody thought about everything from sort of a God-driven situation to evolution in nature, and people thought of Darwin as sort of a somewhat crazy guy. But it turns out Darwin was passionate about orchids. He liked, at the time he wrote The Origin of Species, he was already far into orchids. And here he published this book in 1862. And we have a copy of it at our place. And it's just amazing the detail and the understanding of orchid ecology that Darwin knew even way back when. And here's a comment that he made: that orchids are universally acknowledged to rank among the most singular and modified forms in the vegetable kingdom, i.e. there's a lot of diversity. And he also said that orchids exhibited power and movement and acted upon strong desires in concert with their pollinators. So again, a lot of the focus has been on pollination. This orchid on the right is called Darwin's orchid. It grows in Madagascar. And when Darwin found this orchid and identified it, you'll notice it has a really long spur. It can be about 30 centimeters long. And he predicted at that time that this had to be pollinated by a very long-tongued insect. And there's this caricature of it. And about 30 years later, they actually found it. And you can go on the web now and you can find videos of this happening. So this whole idea of pollination and how orchids go about their business and how their flowers have evolved in shapes and sizes and colors is really an intriguing thing unto itself. I don't have a lot, I don't have time to go into that tonight, but I'm going to show you a video that gives you what I think is one of the strangest but interesting examples of how the plants and animals have evolved together. So hopefully...
The orchid has a different strategy.
Can you see it, Liz? It's okay?
It synchronizes its
hear it,
emergence with the brief mating season
Can't see it.
of the teenid wasp.
Oh, okay, hang on. So you cannot see it?
Yep.
Oh, why? I wonder why. Because you and I saw it. I haven't done anything different. Oh,
You have to drag it into the other window.
maybe let's try. Okay, let's try that. See if that helps. Does that work?
Nope.
No. Oh my goodness. Oh, what did you and I do before? We saw it, but we didn't hear it. No, and you can't see.
Oh, I just sent a chat. If you click share again, you should be able to pick the other screen to share instead of the PowerPoint.
Okay, we'll stop share. We'll share, and we'll pick. Let's see, which one do we want to pick? Where do I have it? Okay, let's try this one. Is that working?
It is not. Let me see here. Let me try. I have it queued up here. Let me try sharing.
That still not working?
No.
No.
No, Barn.
Okay, here, let me try.
Okay. Okay, so want to try the other screen, see if it works? Ah, Liz is going to do it. Okay.
Oh, there we go.
There you go.
As a
Can you
You
hear it?
got it. So you can stop that, Liz. Thank you. Okay, so no, I gotta go back, right?
Yeah, just back to read to the presentation to share.
We there?
Presenter view.
Okay, well, switch that around. Oh, wait.
Perfect.
Maybe back to the beginning. I don't want to do that. Okay, so that's incredibly interesting coevolution between insects and orchids, and there are lots of examples of that in the orchid world. The other thing I'll mention to you is that unlike that orchid did not offer anything to the pollinator. It didn't give it anything. The insect was just interested in sex, and it got duped. Many of our orchids are that way. They have beautiful flowers. They offer nothing to the animal that ends up pollinating them. And the best example, many of you may have seen the pink lady slippers. Lady slippers do that. They don't offer any reward to the pollinator. It's a form of pollination called deceptive pollination, and orchids have really figured that one out incredibly. So I'm going to jump now and start talking about a little bit about the ecology of orchids. So on the left-hand side, you see a drawing of seeds of different orchids. And the point to make here is, one, they're really tiny. They're called dust seeds. And unlike most plants, orchids, the mother orchid plant, when they're producing the seeds, they don't put any stored food in the seed, in with the baby. Like if you think of a bean has a little baby bean in it, but it has a lot of food for the bean to use when it germinates. There's no stored food in orchid seeds. The other thing is that you'll notice most of these have like little dark spots in the middle. That's the embryo inside the seed, and it's not differentiated. There's no top, bottom, anything like that. So the evolution that evolutionary track orchids have made is to not put resources into any seed, but produce lots of seeds. So orchids produce, in a fruit of an orchid, you might find 100,000 to 1,000,000 seeds, and they're all wind dispersed. There are very few orchids that have seeds that are dispersed by animals or anything like that. Almost all of them are wind dispersed. So I make that point. On the right-hand side, you see something I'm going to talk about, which is the interactions between orchids and fungi. Almost all plants on Earth interact with fungi, trees, herbs, shrubs, you name it. But in most cases, the interaction between the plant and the fungus is one that both parties benefit from. That's called mutualism. So the fungus gets something out of the deal, and the plant gets something out of the deal. Orchids have evolved to take that to a much higher level. And I'm going to show you that basically orchids eat fungi. They don't give anything back to the fungus. They use the fungus. They take advantage of it. And so native orchids cannot exist unless the right fungus is in the environment where the seed germinates, where the plant is growing. If that didn't happen, that plant might survive, but it wouldn't reproduce. I'll explain that in a little more detail. So after an orchid seed germinates, the next stage in the life of the orchid is called a protocorm. And here we have pictures of protocorms of 4 of the orchids that occur at our site at the Smithsonian. You'll notice they're all white in color. The other thing you'll notice is on the images where I also have pictures of seeds. Here's a seed, here's a protocorm. Here's a seed, here's a protocorm. Here's a seed, here's a protocorm. So once the seed germinates and that little embryo that's in there, it has to get the resources that it needs to grow to become something of this size. In the laboratory for many orchids now, we know how to germinate the seeds and grow the protocorms. We put them on agar and we give them the right food basically, and they can grow. But in nature, that's not how it works. So the other thing I want to point out at this stage is these are all white. And so if you're a plant and you're white, that means you cannot photosynthesize, which means you cannot make your own food. So in nature, to go from a seed to something this size, the orchid has to find its food, and that's where the fungus comes in. We don't know a lot about orchid seeds in nature because they are so tiny. You can't dig up the soil and find them very easily. So some years ago, this lady on the left, Hannah Rasmussen, she came over to my lab as a postdoc from Denmark. And she's the one who got us into the fungal side of this, but she and I had other things that we interacted with on. And one of them is we tried to figure out what's going on with orchid seeds. And so we came up with a very simple method shown down here on the left that we published in the American Journal of Botany, where you take plankton netting, put some seeds on it, fold it over, and then put it into a slide mount. The techniques evolved far beyond this, but once you've done that, then you can put many of these out in the field, like we're showing down here in the bottom right. And up here is my collaborator, Melissa McCormick. She and a colleague from West Virginia, PJ Harmon, we're putting seed packets, is what we call these things. There's a box of seed packets, and we're putting them in the ground. There are a couple of things that we've learned from that. One is that most people thought orchid seeds were very fragile because they're so small. It turns out that that's not the case for almost all orchids. They're very tough. They can live in the soil for long periods of time before they germinate or die. And the other advantage of the seed packets, not only learning how long seeds persist, but down here in the lower right, you see a seed packet that we've opened up. And here's a seed that had germinated and was growing into a little baby orchid. And this part right here in the middle that my cursor's on, that's the protocorm. And this orchid is making its first leaf and its first root. What this enables us to do is we can take this plant back into the laboratory, and I'll show you pictures later on, and we can get the fungus out of there, and we can analyze that fungus to find out what it is. And it turns out that some orchids use same fungi all the time. Some perhaps use a different fungus for this stage of their life and a different orchid for another stage of their life. But to stress the point that orchid seeds can last a long time, here's this Isotria that we do a lot of work with. And here are two seed packets that we worked with a guy in New England, Bill Brumback. And Bill, he sent us the seeds. We made the seed packets, sent them to him. He buried them in the soil in New Hampshire. And 13 years later, he sent us these two seed packets. We opened them up, and over here you can see there's still lots of seeds. They haven't germinated, and they all have little embryos in here. And what we stain these, so we can tell they're still alive. We don't know whether they're going to germinate or not, but these things have been in the ground for 13 years. So that's kind of hanging out and waiting for the right things to happen. So let's bring this whole thing together with orchids and their mycorrhiza. So this is a made-up picture of a leaf, a fungus, where the fungus tends to be on the root of the orchid. And then if you could look inside that root into the cells in that root, this is what you would see. You would see basically it looks like a little ball of cotton. It's called a peloton. And it doesn't matter what fungus it is, this is what they form in orchid cells in the roots, if that's where they occur. So where do those fungi occur on the plant? Well, typically they occur on the root, but they don't occur on all roots, and they don't occur everywhere on a given root. So what we found is when we've looked at the abundance of these pelotons in the cells of the root, there are places where they mostly occur. We can train somebody to find these and work with them in the lab in half hour. It's not rocket science at all. So there's another drawing to show what happens. So out here you have the orchid growing into the epidermis of the root, growing into the cells, growing, and forming this peloton. What happens, and we don't know what causes this or when, but at some point in time, this connection to the outside world is broken. And at that point in time, the orchid can then begin to digest the peloton. And that's what you're looking at here. Here's a peloton. Over here, some that are being digested. Here's some that are being digested. So this process is ongoing all the time. So literally, the orchid is eating the fungus. Not all orchids have their fungi in roots. There are some orchids that have very minimal roots. They form corms and bulbs. And here's one, the tway blade, which you would have in Western Pennsylvania. And if you looked at an old corm, you'd find the fungus down here at the base of the corm where the root is coming out. But this orchid, like many orchids, it basically replaces its whole body each year. So when the growing season begins, the springtime, it starts making a new corm, which will flower. And that fungus is over here now. And then by the end of the year, the old corm is gone and you have a completely new plant. So this is the term for this is pseudo-annual. So a lot of orchids do this, but so there's some that have their fungus in places other than, inside the roots. Now, to put that all together, here's the life cycle of an orchid. It's like every other plant. You start from a seed, but now we know that there's an intermediate stage called a protocorm before you have a seedling, a little baby orchid. And of course, the seedling grows, and when it's not flowering, we call it a vegetative plant. When it flowers, and it produces more seeds. One thing I haven't talked about yet is that many of our orchids have a dormant phase, which means they can stay below ground for different periods of time. The best example is a pink lady slipper, which we know can stay dormant for at least 25 years. So you ask yourself, how can a green plant stay underground and survive for 5, 10, 15, 20 years and then reappear? Well, it's because of the fungus. So if you take these two stages in particular, the fungi is really important. So for every orchid, it interacts with fungi at every stage in its life. So if you're going to conserve an orchid or you're going to move an orchid around, you better make sure that right fungus is there with it. And here's a picture of the pink lady slipper, which Doug Gill at the University of Maryland studied populations and found individuals reappearing after they'd been below ground for 25 years. There's an orchid in Australia that never comes above ground. It goes through its entire life cycle below ground. It produces a flower that will appear right at the surface of the soil, but it never emerges. This process of using fungi to get through your life has sort of evolved to the highest level in the orchids. There are groups of orchids. Here's one of them, a species of Coryza, which has no green leaves at all. It goes through its entire life eating fungi. There's a term for that. It's called mycofungal, mycoheterotroph. And heterotroph is like you and I. We just put food in and we digest it. We're heterotrophs. So there are orchids that are heterotrophs. Probably the best example is this genus Coryza. And what I'm showing here are a group of pictures of group of species. And the color that's around them is indicating how much, whether they're photosynthesizing or whether they're getting their energy from fungi. So you have one that's completely autotrophic over here to one that's fully mycotrophic over here. And on the bottom is sort of a diagram of how that works. So some species get most of their carbon from photosynthesis, and other species get all of their carbon from fungi. As far as we know, there really aren't any native orchids that are 100% autotrophic, never getting anything from fungi. There are people around the world out there looking for them now and see if they can find it. But everyone that has done this so far, the fungi are key at some point in time. So here's an orchid that is at our site at CERC. I showed you a protocorm of this one. This is the autumn coral root. This thing is below ground for 10 months out of the year. It appears in late September, October, emerges. It's self-pollinating, at least the ones at our place are. They're just little seed machines. And it turns out that this orchid, the fungus that it's interacting with is a type of fungus called a ectomycorrhizal fungus. And that's a group of fungi that are interacting with trees and shrubs, other plants, but mostly trees and shrubs. And they form a little mantle around the root of the tree. And ecologically, what this does is, if this is the tree and its roots, being connected with the fungi gives the tree a much larger area to get resources from. So the tree gets water and nutrients from the fungus, and in exchange, the tree is giving the fungus carbon compounds, basically. And our little orchid, our little Corallarhiza, is sitting out here at the tip, working off of some of the fungi. So if you do a chemical analysis of a tree and the fungus and the orchid, they're exactly the same. So this plant is functionally a tree parasite. It's a parasite indirectly on the tree. And we know this is going on in a lot of different orchids. So it's a happy little orchid. Tree has no idea this is going on. You know, there's not enough of its resources that are being used by the orchid to even bother the tree. They don't even know. So clearly, orchid mycorrhizal fungi need to be present in the environment for orchids to survive. But is there anything else that is important? Is it just the fungus has to be there? We have some of the first evidence that the quantity of the fungus may be just as important as to whether or not the fungus has to be there, but how much is there may also be important. And I'll show you how we learned that. So here's our Isotria again, this threatened species we work with. It interacts with ectomycorrhizal fungi also, connected to trees. So we've been studying this plant in a bunch of places, and down in this diagram, you're looking at time down here, 2008, 2018. And the gray bar is just one population that we studied. The black is the sum of all the other populations that we studied at this site. And so what you can see is the numbers total, and for each of the two groupings goes up and down. And what was happening is we noticed that a tree in the area was beginning to die, a red maple, around 2011, 2012. And as we were moving forward in time, this population 15 went from about, 20 plants down to 2 plants. So we thought it was gone. This tree dies, and then all of a sudden you see in this year and this year and this year, and then it exploded. And we went by 2018, we had 80 plants in that population. It went from 2 to 80. So, you know, what happened there? So our hypothesis was that when the tree died standing, the below ground, the underground part of that tree was available for fungi and invertebrates and everybody else to have a dinner. And so our hypothesis was that the abundance of the fungus increased to the point where a lot of plants that were dormant were able to pop up above the ground. And fortunately, we had a master student, Rachel Rock Blake, study this population and others back in about 2014, 15. And what she did is she took soil samples next to the orchids, within 10 centimeters of the orchid. And we have techniques, molecular techniques, where we can not only identify if the fungus is present, but how much of the fungus is present. So she did that back in the mid 2015, 16, published it in 17. And so here's what she found. So she did this sampling in 2011, and at sites where there were no orchids growing, this is how much fungus she found. This is a quantity. That's what this number is over here. It's abundance. Fortunately, because she did this, we were able to repeat her experiment after the population recovered. And we went back and sampled fungi in areas where there weren't any orchids. You can see there's a big difference in these two yellow bars. The fungal abundance was much higher. But when we sampled the soil adjacent to the orchid, this is what Rachel found over here, and it almost doubled when we went back. So that led us to this sort of hypothesis of fungal abundance. So I'm ready to jump into, and we're doing an experiment on that. I'll show you later on another video. So Liz, we may have to help with this one too. So here we go. So what I'm going to do on this video is I've talked a lot about orchids and their life cycle and all this stuff, but orchids have truly evolved to be, important components of ecosystems around the earth. And some of what I told you, but some other things is in this little video.
Earth's most ubiquitous life
We hear this
forms
one,
tend
Liz?
to be generalists, species whose individuals
I
can
can
adapt
hear it, I
to
can't see
just
it.
about anything,
Okay.
anywhere. But the flowering plant family known as orchids have gained a global presence by being specialists, with each species customized to a very specific habitat. And behind
Dennis,
orchids'
we can't
wild
see it.
variety of looks and
Can't see
behaviors
it.
are the
Oh,
same few stingy
it.
strategies. For
Okay.
one, while other flowering plants send their seeds off with a supply
Well, it's the same deal. You and I could see it, but not then, huh? Did you just stop sharing?
Yeah, maybe
Okay.
try sharing again.
Okay, we'll try sharing again.
Yeah. Just select the screen that has the YouTube.
Okay, I'm gonna do this. I've got this on my computer.
We can see it now.
You see it?
Yep, go ahead and play.
Earth's
You're
most
good.
ubiquitous life
Yes.
forms tend to be generalists, species whose individuals can adapt to eating just about anything, anywhere. But the flowering plant family known as orchids have gained a global presence by being specialists, with each species customized to a very specific habitat. And behind orchids' wild variety of looks and behaviors are the same few stingy strategies. For one, while other flowering plants send their seeds off with a supply of victuals to get them growing, orchids don't. Instead, their seedlings must trick fungi into feeding them until they're old enough to photosynthesize their own food. At that point, some species start giving back, but others hoodwink their fungal partners into lifelong one-way relationships. In fact, several are so dedicated to mooching that they don't even have the ability to produce their own sugar. And many orchids also cheat their pollinators. While most flowers offer snacks to the critters who transfer their pollen, orchids have a rich array of disguises that make them look or smell like the pollinator's potential mates or their favorite sugar-filled flowers. For example, Australian hammer orchids look and smell like flightless female wasps. But when a male tries to carry her off to mate, he catapults instead into the flower's sex organs, sometimes picking up a sticky packet of pollen. Then there's the orchid's choice of real estate. Instead of setting down roots in a patch of rich soil, and then having to waste energy competing with other plants for light and nutrients, most orchids settle in inhospitable, low-rent locations like bare bedrock, soggy bogs, or the branches of trees. Orchids have customized these miserly habits, mooching off of fungi, cheating pollinators, and choosing cheap real estate, to habitats ranging from sub-Antarctic islands to tropical rainforests. And in the process, they've blossomed into an astounding 25,000 species, most of which are specialized to live in only one particular place with its particular conditions. And their wild variety and exotic looks have not escaped our notice. During the so-called orchid delirium in 19th century England, rich aristocrats sent orchid hunters off to scour the tropics for rare, valuable finds. The hunters even sometimes torched or razed the forest behind them in a quest for exclusivity. Today, it's illegal to collect or trade wild orchids, but tens of thousands of flowers are sold on the black market each year, some for tens of thousands of dollars. And while orchid hunters themselves no longer chop down whole forests, vast swaths of prime orchid habitat are lost to deforestation each year, putting thousands of orchid species at risk of extinction. And yet, orchids' diverse splendor may actually help save them, thanks to the devotion of a global network of orchid files. In 2010, police in England stood guard around the clock to protect the country's last wild lady slipper orchid from thieves. And in Ecuador, home to some of the highest densities of orchids in the world, conservationists established rainforest reserves to save the remarkable-looking Dracula orchids. Meanwhile, Australian citizens are building fences to protect threatened spider orchids from grazing rabbits and kangaroos. And scientists in the US are breeding rare cigar orchids in the lab and planting them in their native habitat in South Florida. All to save a bunch of plants that lie, cheat, steal, and ooh, that one's pretty. Hey.
Okay, are we back to the slide now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to switch a little bit, get into the conservation side of this. So orchids occur on all the continents except Antarctica. And this map shows that they're in all the US states and Canadian provinces. And the colors here give you some indication of, how many different species occur there. So you in Pennsylvania, you're in the 60 to 69 species category. Florida has the most because there's a subtropical climate there, and there are a lot of epiphytic orchids occurring in Florida. But I've done research in Alaska on wetlands and even some orchid work, and there are like 35 species up there. So they occur everywhere. They tend to be smaller in number in when it gets drier, like here in this part of the country. But we have a rich diversity of them. And this kind of goes back to one of my first slides. They come in all kinds of colors and sizes. Very beautiful plants. That's how many roughly we have in the US and Canada. So it's not a huge number. In that video, they were saying about 25, 30,000 globally. Most of them globally are epiphytes. They're growing on trees in the tropics. So, you know, that can't happen here in the winter, obviously. So there are only about 220 species. That'll come to play in a few minutes when I talk about what we're doing with orchid conservation. But we did a study some years ago, and what we found is that 59% of our native orchids are in trouble someplace where they occur. There was also was a global study where they gathered all information on about 1,000 different species of orchids around the world for which there was enough information to know what their status was. And the number that were in trouble was about the same there, about 60%. So if you have 60% of anything that's in trouble, we should be concerned. And this is actually what caught my attention about 11 years, almost 12 years ago now, to do something about orchid conservation, because there existed no organization at the scale of the whole country to do anything about it. So what's happened to our orchids? There are a few examples where we have enough historical data to know what has gone on, but there was a study by Matt Pace in 2020 he published that was on orchids in New York State, and this is really, I think, what's gone on because of human development of the landscape or either contamination, pollution kind of thing. So this is the dragon's mouth orchid, a very beautiful one you have in Pennsylvania. And the dots show where that orchid occurred in 1850. And he was able to do this by going back into look at herbarium specimens and finding any information he could about this orchid and where it occurred. By 1900, it doesn't look that different. But by 1950, you know, when we really started changing the earth here that we live on, the number was really declining. And by 2017, it's down to just a handful of population. So this has probably gone on in most areas of the country and why orchids have declined. There are some that are really in peril. This is an example of an orchid that we're working on in Arizona. It only occurs in Arizona. It's a Spiranthes. And it was known historically from 4 sites in Arizona. Now it's only known from 2 sites, and we only have access to it at one of the sites. But we have a current project where we're working with the Desert Botanical Garden in Phoenix to try to grow and bring this orchid back to a viable number of populations. So to me, this is the message to you, is I hope there is a need for conservation of native orchids. There are groups that do this. There are ways that it's happening. Globally, the IUCN has a red list that all orchids are on, so this limits their international trade. In the United States, we have the Endangered Species Act, which is, you know, it works functionally, but it's a political thing too, and there are probably a lot of orchids that ought to be on it that aren't. In that video, they mentioned there are organizations that conserve land. There's really not much of this going on in the US. There are a few examples of it. We should have native orchids growing in botanical gardens, but I can guarantee you if you go to the Phipps in Pittsburgh or any place like that, you're not going to find any native orchids there because they mostly have to grow outside. So we have, in reality, we have very few native orchids growing in botanical gardens, but I think as we move forward with our work, I think botanical gardens will become important places for orchid conservation of native orchids. And then there are a few places where they're actually doing restoration of native orchids. The Million Orchid Project in Florida is the best one that we have in this country. You can go on the internet and find the Million Orchid Project and learn about that. So there are a few examples where people are actually doing things. So that led me to start this organization, the North American Orchid Conservation Center, where we employ an evolutionary and an ecological approach to conservation. And our logo, I think, captures all the things I've been telling you so far. To conserve orchids, you need to know about the orchid. You need to know about the fungus. You need to know about the environment in which it occurs. And we're going to need us, humans, to help put this all together to conserve and restore a lot of our native orchids. So our mission is simple: to conserve our native orchid heritage, initially in the US and Canada. I think the model can be applied anywhere in the world. And this is how we go about it. So our model has sort of three underpinnings. The first one is preservation, where we collect things from native orchids and store them in banks, seed banks and fungal banks. The second thing is we're just getting into now, which is to take the seeds and the fungi and learn how to propagate them. We started a new project just this past year that has initially a 5-year thing, and by the end of that, we hope we can show people how to propagate 25 of our native orchids and eventually all 200 plus. And then, because most Americans are really botanically illiterate, we're really interested in education and ways to reach people and get them a little bit excited about what it is we do, kind of like the talk tonight. But for any of this to work, we have to have people like you helping us. So collaboration, which you'll see more of in a minute, is really essential, because there only is a small number of scientists doing this work. And we need the public to be involved to help us, not only physically, but financially. So just a couple of images of what happens to the seed banking. You've seen this before, and you've seen this before. Here's a photo of an orchid fruit with probably 100,000 seeds. We lower the humidity exposed to the seeds, and then we store them in glass jars, and we can store them in the fridge or different temperatures. But I have to tell you, we know not much about orchid seed storage, because the people that are into that ball game have ignored orchids because they feel that orchids are different, and so they've ignored them. But we need to do a lot to learn how to adequately store the different species of native orchids to do the propagation. Now the fungal side of it. So there are a few laboratories that do this, not many, probably 4, 5, something like that in this country. So we can take an orchid root here on the left, take it into the lab, put it under a microscope. And I mentioned earlier that, we know where the fungi are. So we use a pair of sharp tweezers or something, and we tease the root. And on this picture, you see a whole bunch of pelotons that we've got out of that particular orchid. When we get to that, we can put them on agar in the laboratory. And if the orchid hasn't started to eat the fungus and it's still viable, and we got the right goodies in there, the fungus will grow. Once we have it, we can store it. Most of these fungi do not produce mushrooms, and so we know generally what fungi orchids interact with, but not specifically at the species level. And so the only way these things don't produce fruiting bodies. So the only way we can do this is we extract the DNA and then send it off to the lab, and they give us the DNA sequence, and then we can compare what's known, and then we can identify the orchid. And we have the largest collection in the world of orchid fungi in our lab. 99% of them so far completely new to science. We can put them in buckets, but at the species level, we can't do it. So since we started NAOCC in around 2012 or so, kind of here, as a research group, we've been working with roots of orchids for a long time, but now that we're actively collecting leaves and seeds, you can see we're starting to make progress. With roots, we're up to over 100 species now of the 200, so we're kind of slowly getting there. And this is a project that I mentioned we just started this year. It's called the Native Orchid Propagation for Sustainability. We have a bunch of collaborators. I was able to get money from some botanical gardens and foundations shown here. And there's a group of us that are focusing now initially on 25 native orchids distributed across the country, that hopefully in 5 years, we can have the protocols in hand for how you would propagate and restore or grow these orchids in your garden. And I mentioned to Liz, probably in 3 years, maybe, we hope to have enough information on some of these orchids that we will be reaching out to the public, to people like you, to say, hey, if we give you these things, will you do the following? And tell us how it goes. Because you have to test the protocols, obviously, for propagating the native orchids. So this is kind of what will happen. You grow them from seed, you get them in sterile culture, and eventually they get big enough that you put them into something, a container, into a pot, put them in with some soil, and then you plant them. And that's sort of the process that we're going to have to go through. I only know of one publication where this has been done, where we've actually taken from seed, put it with the fungus, got it out in the field, and the plant survived, flowered, and we've identified the fungus as being there. And we've done that with Longwood Gardens, by the way. So going back to that New York example, so here's how many Arethusa sites there are in 2017. Were in 2017. If we are successful at what we want to do, we want to get it back to this. And so this is going to take you, the public, to help us do this. Not just botanical gardens, but people that are interested in plants. So that's my wish. That's sort of my goal. So this is that study we did with Longwood Gardens. Here's Peter Zale, took these 2 orchids. And what we did is we had the fungus in our lab, and that's shown, we grew the fungus on little cotton balls. Peter grew the orchids. We put them into pots with different kinds of substrate, and we put the cotton balls in there with or without the orchid and grew them, and it led to success. So we know it can be done. We just have to figure out the details of it. So I'm getting near the end now. Let's talk a little bit about education. We think that's really important to engage citizen scientists in conservation. If you haven't found it, we have a website that is in need of revision, but it's still a good one. A lot of people visit this. It's called the NAOCC website. You can, there's the just basically North American Orchid Center.org. And there are a lot of things here that you can search. Details like I've told you tonight. Galleries which have photographs of native orchids that different people put together. So there's a lot on here that you can kind of check out. You'll notice there's a link to something called Go Orchids over here. And that's this website. And this was, we actually put most of our initial money into this. We have an interactive website that has all of the native orchids in the US and Canada on it. So you could go, when this opens up on your phone or your PC or whatever, you can go down here and type in Pennsylvania, and up will appear a photograph of all the orchids in Pennsylvania. Click on the picture and it'll take you deeper to learn more about them. This is still a very highly visited website. Over 140,000 views a year by people. But I'm happy to report that a month or 2 ago, we sent all of the material to Cornell University Press to produce a field guide where it'll have, it's basically a in your hand mimic of Go Orchids. Because you can only use Go Orchids if you have access to the internet. We've never got the money to do an app on your phone yet. But in hopefully a year and a half, you're going to have this lovely little book in your hand that we've written that will have a field guide to all the native orchids. It's the first one in, I don't know, 25 years, the only one that will have both Canada and the US. So we're really excited about that happening. Some years ago, I was at a meeting in China, and some guy showed me a paper punch-out model of a native orchid. And I thought that was cool. So I came back and I got a grant to design 25 of these models of our native orchids representing different parts of the country. The guy who does this is a Dutchman. We contracted with him to do the design and work with us. And so we've had these for years now. We've given out over 60,000 of them for educational purposes. I've gone to meetings and taken them, and people have used them. And then about 3 years ago, we were approached by Tuttle Publisher to produce a packet of 20 of these models and a booklet that we wrote. And you can get this on Amazon, or you can connect with me and I can send it to you and you can pay for it. They're about $20 for that. Generates a little bit of money for us, but not a huge amount. But these are pretty popular. People have used them in all kind of arenas. This top picture is I went to visit an orchid club in New York City, really, and we did an orchigami thing before they had their meeting, and these are the models that the people put together there. But there are some people use them in sort of displays. There's a lady in Hawaii who does this stuff that really uses them in very interesting ways. We have a project called Orchids in the Classroom. And the goal here is to educate younger people. And what we do is we train the teachers and we give them everything they need in the classroom to do an experiment with the kids. And then the teachers run it. We help them, obviously. We've run this program for over 1,000 middle school students and teachers in the DC area. It kind of went quiet during COVID, but we got another grant through the Smithsonian to revitalize it. It's now being used again in the DC metro area, but we're collaborating with other members of our sort of national team. Longwood Gardens has helped us, a bunch of them have, and they're just listed here. But in 2024, or I'm sorry, we're working in the DC area in 2024. In 2025, this program is going to Minnesota, Alaska, and Delaware. And I think this is something that can be a national program to teach STEM sort of thing. So I really hope that goes. So I mentioned the collaboration's essential to what it is we do. So even the NAOCC was started by funding initially a seed grant from the Smithsonian. Smithsonian Gardens has been a financial provider all along, as has the U.S. Botanic Garden. But over here you see, we have about 60 organizations that have or are involved with us in some way or another all over the country. And we're always looking for new collaborators and individuals, so maybe in this audience, that can help us. And we have procedures that we can provide you, and you can help us with some of our work. Examples of collaborative projects, that orchid quantity thing I mentioned a little bit earlier, we're actually doing an experiment at Prince William Forest Park and Fort Walker on this isotria, where we're actually doing a replicated experiment, killing trees and measuring the fungus in the soil and tracking what the orchids do. We go to meetings such as the Native Orchid Symposium that's somewhere around the country every year and work with people there to help us make collections. But we're also doing some other kind of cool things. We came up with this idea to see if we could train dogs to smell orchids. Dogs can smell everything, right? And turned out they can. I'm going to show you a little video of a dog sniffing isotria down at Prince William Forest Park. We've done this 2 years now, and turns out the dogs are just about as good as people at finding these things. Even this year, the dogs look like they could find things that are underground. So when the dog sniffs it, it sits down and gets a reward. Another project that we started that you could help us with, if you're out there doing native orchids, is who's pollinating our native orchids. We know who pollinates some of them, but there's never been a systematic study of any one species across its range of distribution. So Melissa McCormick, who's now running NAOCC since I've retired, she's working with some people with these motion cameras that they put out by the orchid, one for the day and one for the night. And then when an animal comes to pollinate, it takes a video. And she's working with AI to kind of help go through these videos to see. So here's a swallowtail. If you look closely, you'll see it actually has pollinia on its face in this dactyl rhiza. So this is an example of one of the videos that came from the work that she's doing. And she's looking for volunteers and ways to expand this to a national project also. We go to all kinds of places where we try to spread the word. We've been at the Chelsea Flower Show in London for the last 2 years, and we're going again next year. This is the largest orchid show in the world. And we go there and we tell them about native orchids. And so we're using this as a venue, as a way to kind of get the word out. So orchid conservation it's complex. I hope I've given you that message. There are a lot of elements, and it all needs to be supported by research, education, and collaboration. We need to put this puzzle together, and we really haven't done it yet for many native orchids. So our mission is still there, conserve our native orchids. And although I've spoken tonight, when I say we, it's a small group of people. So Melissa McCormick is a collaborator at the Smithsonian. She's another scientist there. She and I have worked together for 25 years. She's now running the NAOCC since I've retired. She also runs a molecular lab at our part of the Smithsonian. Jay O'Neill was my technician in the lab for like 40 years. He's really been very involved in, other than the research we did, keeping our websites going. So he's been great. And then Julianne McGinnis was, I was up in Alaska and I visited her. She was a director of the Alaska Botanical Garden. She since moved back to New Jersey with a mother who was aging. And she's been essential to our success. She really helps us. She's technically our program development coordinator. And then we wouldn't be doing any of this if Hannah Rasmussen hadn't come over from Denmark to turn us on to the fungi. So Hannah and I still interact. But we've had a whole range of people come over the years to help us out from around the world. Haeyu Shin is over here now from South Korea. Ida Hartvig is from Denmark. Benny Crane's a good old American guy, but he worked with us to take our model for conservation to Palau, an island out in the Pacific Ocean. So we've had a lot of people help us out, interns, students, things like that. So I want to go back to this notion that collaboration is essential. So if any of you are interested in helping us, reach out to me and we can make that happen and do it in a way that works for you. Have to say who's financed this all over the years: Smithsonian Gardens, the U.S. Botanic Garden. I mentioned them. We've had a number of national organizations, American Orchid Society, a couple private organizations like Dominion Energy. And then we've had some other botanical gardens that have worked with us and a couple of foundations that are giving us money. And then our Hal Horowitz, he's going to be an author of this field guide. He's passed away, but he and Helen were early contributors to us, and they helped establish our first endowment at the Smithsonian. But basically, we have annually about 250 people that donate to us and help us. And I have to mention, none of this is on federal dollars, taxpayer dollars. I've had to raise every cent that's gone to do this. So any amount that you contribute, if you're interested in this sort of thing, from 25 to 25 million would be great. Please contact us, and you can donate on our website, by the way. So that's it, Liz. That's all I have to say, and hopefully there's some time for questions.
Yeah, we have a few questions in the chat, and I wanted to thank you so much. That was such a great talk. So the first question we had in the chat, which was a little earlier in the presentation, is there a specific type of mycorrhizal fungi that orchids use, or just any fungus?
Well, it's not any fungus. There are groups of fungi that seem to be the ones that interact with orchids. So we know that much. But when it gets down to what would be the equivalent of the species level, that's where we don't have a lot of information. But so in the fungal world, there are these ectomycorrhizal fungi that have these mantles around roots. There is another group of fungi called arbuscular mycorrhizae. These are fungi that go into the roots of the plant and form little webby things like pelotons. But as far as we know, there are no orchids that interact with that group of fungi. Maybe one example in the literature. And then there's another group of fungi called ericoid mycorrhizae. These are fungi that interact with things in the blueberry family. And as far as we know, the orchids don't interact with that group of fungi either. And so they don't interact with every fungus. They interact with broad groupings of fungi. But to be honest with you, there have been so few orchids that have been studied molecularly around the world. We're still at the beginning of understanding that, but we know they're big groups. Hope that helped.
The next question is, what predates orchids in our area? Do mammals, including deer, eat them? How about birds?
Not birds, as far as I know. Deer. So in many of our population studies, particularly of that isotria, we actually cage the orchids every year. We go out in the springtime, find the orchid, measure them, put a cage on them to keep the deer from eating them. So deer eat them. I think I don't know whether voles or mice, probably mice, but voles probably also. Once in a while, you'll see a little tunnel next to an orchid, and the orchid's gone. So there's some small mammals that eat them. There are some insects, and of course there are pathogens like bacteria and fungi that get on them too. But most of them are pretty hardy. every once in a while you'll see a native orchid and it's all black or some caterpillars eating half of it. So, but we just really don't know much about that at all.
Right. Another one. As home gardeners, are there any cultural practices we could adopt to encourage native orchids?
In our area, most of the orchids occur in I would say fairly rich soil, with a lot of organic matter, a lot of humus, be the way to go. I was telling Liz, if you want, for the terrestrial orchids, it's tough. There really aren't a lot of, well, there aren't sources of material, number one, but number two, it's not that easy to grow them. You can purchase some. You can go to the internet and you can get some orchids that are grown properly from seed, especially the lady slipper orchids. Most of them are grown in Wisconsin and Minnesota, though, and so you can buy them like $50 a plant, bring it, put it in your garden, and some people have had luck with that for a few years. I don't know of anybody who's ever told me they've done that and ended up with a sustainable population where the plant they brought in lived long enough to flower and produce seeds, and those seeds had babies, and on you go. I've never heard that story yet, but probably the easiest ones to propagate are orchids that live in bogs, in wetlands. And if I was telling Liz, if you go onto the Longwood Gardens website, Peter Zale, he has a video, I hope it's still on that site, where he describes to people how to make little mini bogs, and orchids you can grow them in them pretty successfully.
All right, let me skip the screen back up here. With the topic of propagating seeds and eventually reaching out to the public for test protocols, is there a sign-up list?
Not yet. My guess is that will begin to take shape in 2 or 3 years once we are kind of out of the gates on some small number of native orchids where we can grow them. And it'll probably be two kind of things. Well, there'll be some people that will be interested in who might want to grow them from seed, and we could probably provide the seed and maybe even the fungus too. And if you have the right stuffer in your house or wherever you're working, you can try to grow them from seed. But then I also imagine that probably more likely will be when we grow plants that are big enough that we can give them to people and say, okay, if you create this soil mix and and you have a good, and put it in this environment, there's a good chance this orchid will grow, and we would send you the orchid that might have its fungus already in the root, or we might send you the orchid and send you the fungus to put in the soil. So we're not quite sure yet, but I would say 3 to 4 years we'll be there with some orchids.
Well, I know many of us are very excited for that day. Another question, do any of my sightings using iNaturalist get used for your research locations, especially the locations?
So we discourage putting location information on anything like that. And particularly if it's an orchid that's uncommon, because there are people that will go and dig it up. And so, for example, on our site, whenever we do anything on our websites, you can't find any latitude, longitude information. So the best thing, if you're looking locally, the best thing is try to find some people that know where the orchids are if you want to go see them, and they'll take you to see them, or if you're trustworthy, they'll tell you where to go. But we try to minimize that kind of information.
That is all of the questions that are currently one more came in. Do bog type orchids require the same mycorrhizal relationships? I think of bog substrate as being less soil and more sphagnum and muck.
No, same deal. They have to have the fungus. Because remember that when the seed germinates, it's not green. And so the protocorm cannot become a seedling unless the right fungus is there. So bogs have fungi too.
And that is all of the questions in the chat. Anyone, feel free to pop on and unmute if you have any additional questions. Yeah.
Yeah, so, in closing, thank yins. And if anyone has any questions or wants to get engaged with us, Liz can probably give you my email and I'll put you in touch with the right people, and hopefully we can get you to help us out a little bit. So thanks a lot, and go Steelers.
Dennis grew up in Western Pennsylvania, so
Yeah, Roughdale,
he's one of
Pennsylvania.
us.
Okay, thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
I have a question actually, if it's not too late. I
It
think
might be too late. It looks
Never
like
mind.
he popped off. Well, thank you, everybody.